Hey guys, today's episode is brought to you by no one. I think I tried it already like 4 times. So let's just start the show. So what can a nuclear weapon do? How do they achieve their destructive purpose? And what would a nuclear war and its aftermath look like? A lot of you are asking yourselves this question after you've seen Fox and CNN and all this kind of stuff with the current issues that we're having with Russia and China and North Korea and all this kind of stuff. So today I'm going to scare you by demonstrating the realities. Not demonstrating, I can't detonate something, but I can show you through science. I can't show you anything. I can just tell you what I know about nuclear weapons and the atomic age and all that kind of stuff. So instead of just telling you what it does, let's go down a timeline. So in August 1942, the Manhattan Project established itself in the United States. So the United States set up the Manhattan Project to develop the first nuclear weapon. And in, I believe, July... I should look this up. Yeah, July 16th, 1945, the U.S. conducts its first ever nuclear test. So the United States tested a 15 to 20 kiloton nuclear weapon south of Socorro, New Mexico. Radiation levels around the site remain 10 times as high as natural background radiation. So what's crazy is when Oppenheimer, when he first developed this bomb, and he saw what the destruction of the power is, he gave a very interesting speech when they asked him about it. So let's hear him say it.
We knew the world would not be the same.
We knew the world would not be the same.
Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Whew. So a bomb explodes. Let's look at the short-term effects. The most immediate effect of a nuclear explosion is an intense burst of nuclear radiation, primarily gamma rays and neutrons. This direct radiation is produced in a weapon's nuclear reaction themselves and lasts well under a second. So there was a book, it was called Hiroshima, and on there it talks about I believe she was a nurse, so a young nurse was talking about what she witnessed when the first bomb went off. So when the first bomb went off, she described it as a flashbulb. Like if you ever seen those old cameras, you see a flashbulb go off. And so if you ever see those old cameras with the flashbulb, that's what she described it was like. It was a sudden flash. And it was so quick that if you were anywhere protected, she happened to be in the bathroom when the flash went off. And her sister was outside of the bathroom. So when she came out, she just heard the huge rumble. And she saw her sister laying there on the floor with half of her face melted off, and her eyeball was hanging out. And she says that she took a piece of clothing and then shoved the eye back in her mouth, and in her eye socket, and she couldn't speak because the skin on her mouth was just hanging down, and she was making these terrible moans. That's all she could do. And her sister was pleading for water, and she had children that she had to get to. So she helped her sister, and I think she put a sister on her back, and then went outside, and then she just saw ash. She saw a cart that was a food cart, and it was bright red from the heat, from the immense heat. And she said that she saw a group of people wobbling and stumbling towards her, and they couldn't, and their clothing, where the clothing was, they were protected. Nothing happened. It was so quick. It was a second of a flash. So, but the rest of the body, she said that the undead were walking. So they looked like zombies because the skin was hanging off their faces. So that's a description that she gave of the. All right, so that was my story. Oh, man, sorry guys, I had a glitch here in this matrix. So, anyways, let's continue. Lethal direct radiation extends nearly a mile from a 10 kiloton explosion. With most weapons, though, direct radiation is of little significance because of other lethal effects, generally encompass greater distances. An important exception is the enhanced radiation weapon or neutron bomb, which maximizes direct radiation and minimizes other destructive effects. An exploding nuclear weapon instantly vaporizes itself. What was cold, solid material microseconds earlier becomes a gas hotter than the sun's 15 million degree core. This hot gas radiates its energy in the form of X-rays, which the heat of the surrounding air. A fireball superheated air forms and grows rapidly. 10 seconds after a 1 megaton explosion, the fireball is a mile in diameter. The fireball glows visibly from its own heat, so visibly that the early stages of a 1 megaton fireball are many times brighter than the sun, even at a distance of 50 miles. Besides light, the glowing fireball radiates heat. So, this thermal flash lasts many seconds and accounts for more than 1/3 of the weapon's explosive energy. The intense heat can ignite fires and cause severe burns on exposed flesh as far as 20 miles from a large thermonuclear explosion. 2/3 of injured Hiroshima survivors showed evidence of such flash burns. So you can think of the incendiary effects of thermal flash as an analogous to starting a fire using a magnifying glass to concentrate the sun's rays. So the difference is that rays from a nuclear explosion are so intense that they don't need concentration to ignite flammable materials. So as the rapidly expanding fireball pushes into the surrounding air, it creates a blast wave consisting of an abrupt jump in air pressure. The blast wave moves outward initially 1,000 miles per hour, but slows as it spreads. It carries about half the bomb's explosive energy and is responsible for most of the physical destruction. Normal air pressure is about 15 pounds per square inch, or psi if you're lazy. That means every square inch of your body or your house experiences a force of 15 pounds. You don't usually feel that force because air pressure is normally exerted equally in all directions. So the 15 pounds pushing a square inch of your body one way is counterbalanced by 15 pounds pushing the other way. So what you do feel is overpressure caused by a greater air pressure on one side of an object. If you ever try to open a door against a strong wind, you're experiencing overpressure. An overpressure of even 1 in 100 psi could make a door almost impossible to open. That's because the door has lots of square inches, about 13,000 or more. So 1 in 100 psi adds up a lot. It adds up to a lot of pounds, basically what I'm trying to say. The blast wave of a nuclear explosion may create overpressures of several psi many miles from the explosion site. So let's think about that. There are about 50,000 square inches in the front wall of a modest house. And that means 50,000 pounds or 25 tons of force, even at 1 psi overpressure. The overpressures of 5 psi are enough to destroy most residential buildings. An overpressure of 10 psi collapses most factories and commercial buildings, and 20 psi will level even reinforced concrete structures. So people remarkably are relatively immune to overpressure itself, but they aren't immune to collapsing buildings or pieces of glass hurling through the air hundreds of miles per hour, or to having themselves hurled into concrete walls, all of which are direct consequences of a blast wave's overpressure. So blast effects therefore are the ones that cause the many great fatalities. Blast effects depend on what part in one part of where the bomb is detonated. The most widespread damage to buildings occurs in an airburst, a detonation thousands of feet above the target. The blast wave from airburst reflects off the ground, which enhances its destructive power. A ground burst, in contrast, digs a huge crater and pulverizes everything in immediate vicinity, but its blast effects don't extend as far. So nuclear attacks on city would possibly employ air bursts, whereas ground bursts would be on the hardened military targets, such as underground missile silos. As you'll soon see, the two types of blasts have different implications for radioactive fallout. So, how far do a weapon's destructive effect extends? That distance is the radius of destruction. So it depends on the explosive yield. The volume encompassing gives a several level of destruction depends directly on the weapon's yield, because volume is proportional to the radius cubed. Sorry, is that too much for you guys? Oh, I don't care. Let's continue. That means the destructive radius grows approximately as the cube root of a yield. So a tenfold increases in yield there increases the radius of destruction by a factor of only a little over 2. The area of destruction grows faster, but still not in direct proportion to the yield. So that relatively slow increase in destruction with increasing yield is one reason why multiple smaller weapons are more effective than a single larger one. So 20 kiloton warheads, for example, destroyed nearly 3 miles of the area leveled by a numerical equivalent of 1 megaton weapon. So it's crazy is that you look at this huge destruction caused by an atom bomb. This is the atom bomb from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which a lot of people look at that and like, look at how crazy this is. So we're not even done here. So the blast wave is over a minute or so, but the immediate destruction may not be. So fire started by the thermal flash or by blast effects still rage. Under some circumstances, they may coalesce into a single gigantic blaze called a firestorm that can develop its own winds and thus cause the fire to spread. Hot gases rise from the firestorm, replaced by air rushing inward along the surface of hundreds of miles per hour. Winds and fire compound the blast damage, and the fire consumes enough oxygen to suffocate any remaining survivors. So let's look at World War II. So during World War II, bombings of Hamburg with incendiary chemicals resulted in a firestorm that claimed 45,000 lives. The nuclear bombing of Hiroshima resulted in a firestorm. That of Nagasaki did not, likely because of Nagasaki's rougher terrain. The question of firestorms is important not only to the residents of a target area, but the firestorms might also have significant long-term effects of the global climate, as we'll discuss later. Man, did I just mute myself a second ago? Let's continue. So fallout. What is fallout? Both nuclear and conventional weapons produce destructive blast effects, although of vastly different magnitudes. But radioactive fallout is unique to nuclear weapons. Fallout consists primarily of fission products, although neutrons, capture, and other nuclear reactions contribute additionally to radioactive material. The term fallout generally applies to those isotopes whose half-lives exceed the time scale of the blast and other short-term effects. Although fallout contamination may linger for years and even decades, the dominant lethal effects last from days to weeks, and contemporary civil defense recommendations are for survivors to stay inside for at least 48 hours while the radiation decreases. The fallout produced in a nuclear explosion depends greatly on the types of weapons. its explosive yield, and where it exploded. The neutron bomb, although it produces intense direct radiation, is primarily a fusion device and generates only slight fallout from its fission trigger. Small fission weapons like those used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki produce locally significant fallout, but the fission fusion design in today's thermonuclear weapons introduces the new phenomenon of global fallout. That's the thing, is you guys need to understand that as terrible as the Hiroshima and Nagasaki atom bombs were, we now have weapons that use the explosion of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bomb just as the primer for the main explosion. So those weapons are nothing compare, our weapons that we have now, our nuclear warheads and our they make Hiroshima and Nagasaki look like nothing. Albert Einstein said, I don't know what weapons we will fight World War III with, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. He's talking about the atom bomb is so devastating. You can bomb somebody to the Stone Age. It's how crazy this is. That's why the famous quote, who said it? Now I don't think. Was it Albert Einstein? How it said the atom bomb changed everything except for our methods of thinking. Ooh. So, anyways, let's look at modern thermonuclear weapons. So, the new phenomenon of fallout is actually called global fallout. Most of this fallout comes from fission of the U-238 jacket that surrounds the fusion level, the fusion fuel. The global effect of these huge weapons come from partly from the sheer quantity of radioactive material and partly from the fact that the radioactive cloud rises well into the stratosphere, where it takes months or even years to reach the ground. Even though we had no nuclear war since the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, fallout is one of the weapons' effects in which we have experienced atmospheric nuclear testing before the 1963 Partial Test Ban Treaty resulted in detectable levels of radioactive fission products across the globe, as some of the radiation is still with us. So what happens is that when an atom bomb goes off, or a thermonuclear weapon, or a hydrogen bomb goes off, if you survive the flash burn, which with the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bomb, if you survived it, you might have been okay. But dealing with the air pressure hitting you and slamming you against the building and you cracking your skull, the building falling on top of you, that's another thing. But if you survive that, how are you going to survive the radiation and the nuclear fallout, which can be around for days or even weeks, or with the global fallout, months, which makes food unedible because of the radiation poisoning, and water, you can't drink it. So let's look at a recommended response to a nuclear explosion. The United States government has recently provided guidance on how to respond to a nuclear detonation. One recommendation is to divide the region of destruction blast due to effects into 3 separate damage zones. This division provides guidance for the first responders in assessing the situation. Outermost is the light damage zone, characterized by broken windows and easily managed injuries. Next is the moderate damage zone, with significant building damage, rubble, downed utility lines, and some downed poles, overturned automobiles, fires, and serious injuries. Finally, there's the severe damage zone, where buildings will be completely collapsed, radiation levels high, and survivors are very unlikely. The recommendation also define a dangerous fallout zone spanning different structural damage zones. This is the region where dose rates exceed a whole body external dose, or about 0.1 SV. The first responders must exercise special precautions as they approach the fallout zone in order to limit their own radiation exposure. The dangerous fallout zone can easily stretch from 10 to 20 miles. For those of you that are not using the United States system we use here, 15 to 30 kilometers from the detonation, depending on the explosive yield and weather conditions. So I guess that's terrible. Well, that's not it. That's not the end. Electromagnetic pulse. A nuclear weapon exploded at a very high altitude, produces none of the blast or local fallout effects we just described, but intense gamma rays knock electrons out of atoms and the surrounding air. When the explosion takes place in a rarefied air at a high altitude, this effect may extend hundreds of miles as they gyrate in the Earth's magnetic field. The electrons generate an intense pulse of radio waves known as electromagnetic pulse, or an EMP. A single large weapon exploded some 200 miles over the central United States could blanket the entire country with an electromagnetic pulse. So an EMP can take down the grid, which means that no computers, no cars moving around. So if you're in a zone where there's radiation and there's all kinds of stuff, you need to get out and you see a car that's relatively unscathed and you're like, I'm going to get in this car and I'm going to drive to safety. Guess what? That car's not starting because of the EMP. So, yeah. And how far can an EMP... let's see. So a single large weapon exploded some 200 miles. Sorry, I'm looking at a manual here. So if they detonated a 1.4 megaton warhead, so it has an effect of 250 miles. So there you go. So, and that's with a small nuclear warhead. So let's look at nuclear war. This is what we came here for. So far, we've examined the effects of single nuclear explosions, but a nuclear war would involve hundreds to thousands of explosions, creating a situation for which we simply have no relevant experience. Despite decades of arm reductions, treaties, there's still thousands of nuclear weapons in the world's arsenal. Detonating only a tiny fraction of these would cause massive casualties. So what would nuclear war be like? When you think of nuclear war, you probably envision an all-out holocaust in which adversaries unleash their arsenals in an attempt to inflict the most damage. Many people, including the Secretary of Defense, believe that misfortune to be likely an outcome of that misfortune to be the likely outcome of almost any use of nuclear weapons amongst the superpowers. But nuclear strategists have explored many scenarios that fall short of the all-out nuclear exchange. So what might these limited nuclear wars be like? Could they really remain limited? And I like to think that this is wishful thinking, but here we go. One form of limited nuclear war would be like a conventional battlefield conflict, but using low-key tactical nuclear weapons. We've heard of tactical nuclear weapons recently. There's a hypothetical scenario. After its 2014 annexation of Crimea, Russia attacks the Baltic countries with tanks and ground forces while the United States is distracted by domestic crisis. NATO responds with decisive counterforce, destroying Russian tanks with fighter jets, but that doesn't quell Russian resolve. Russia responds with even more tanks and by bombing NATO installations, killing several hundred troops. NATO cannot tolerate such an aggression. To prevent further Russian advance, launches low-key tactical nuclear weapons with the dilate yield position set to the lowest settings of only 300 tons of TNT equivalent. The goal is to signal Russia that it has crossed the line and to de-escalate the situation. NATO's actions are based on fear that if the Russian aggression were stopped, the result would be an all-out war in Northern Europe. So, when you look at these manuals, it's crazy to think about that it's gonna stop right there. But, that's it. But it's not true. So, man, it's crazy to think that there's people out there that believe that we're gonna use small. Okay, all right, okay, tactical nuke. You got it. I get it. I go. No more nuclear weapons. We are done. But there's every reason to believe that limited nuclear war wouldn't remain limited. A 1983 war game known as Proud Prophet involved top secret nuclear war plans and had participants high-level decision makers, including President Reagan's Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger. The war game followed actual plans, but unexpectedly ended in total nuclear annihilation with more than 500 million fatalities the initial onslaught, not including subsequent deaths from starvation. The exercise revealed that a limited nuclear strike may not achieve the desired results. So, what does this mean? That it's wishful thinking. That is just wishful thinking, thinking that it's going to stop there. But let's continue reading this article here. The exercise revealed that a limited nuclear strike may not achieve the desired results. In this case, that was because the team playing the Soviet Union responded to a limited U.S. nuclear strike with massive all-out nuclear attack. So what about an attack on North Korea? In 2017, some of the U.S. cabinet advocate for a bloody nose strategy in dealing with North Korea's flagrant violations of international law. This is the notion that in response to a threatening action by North Korea, the U.S. would destroy a significant site to a bloody Pyongyang's nose. This might employ a low-yield nuclear attack or conventional attack. The bloody nose strategy relies on the expectations that Pyongyang would be so overwhelmed by U.S. that they would immediately back down and not retaliate. However, North Korea might see any type of aggression as an attack aimed at overthrowing the regime and could retaliate with an all-or-nothing response using weapons of mass destruction, including but not necessarily limited to nuclear weapons, as well as their vast conventional forces. So now we know that North Korea actually has nuclear warheads now, and they're testing them. China's taking notice. So man, I'm probably going to have to end the show because this is crazy. So you have China, Russia, and North Korea involved, all of them with nuclear weapons. Russia produces the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. So an all-out nuclear war, whether from escalation of a limited nuclear conflict or as an outright full-scale attack, an all-out nuclear war remains possible as long as nuclear nations have hundreds to thousands of weapons aimed at one another. So what would be the consequence of an all-out nuclear war, you ask? Well, I'm going to tell you. Within individual target cities, conditions described earlier for single explosions would prevail. Most cities, though, would likely be targeted with multiple weapons. Government estimates suggest that over half of the United States population could be killed by the prompt effects of an all-out nuclear war. For those within the appropriate radii of destruction, it would make little difference whether theirs was an isolated explosion or part of a war. But for the survivors in the less damaged areas, the difference could be dramatic. Consider the injured. Thermal flash burns extend well beyond the 5 psi radius of destruction. A single nuclear explosion might produce 10,000 cases of severe burns requiring specialized medical treatment. In an all-out war, there could be several million such cases. Yet the United States have facilities to treat fewer than 2,000 burn cases. Virtually all of them in urban areas that would be leveled by nuclear blasts. Burn victims who might be saved, had their injuries resulted from some isolated cause, would succumb in the aftermath of a nuclear war. The same goes for fractured lacerations, missing limbs, crushed skulls, punctured lungs, and a myriad of other injuries suffered as a result of a nuclear blast. Where could the doctors, the hospitals, the medicines, the equipment needed for their treatment? Most would lie in ruin, and those that remain would be inadequate to overwhelming numbers of injured. Again, many would die, whom modern medicine could normally save. So a single nuclear explosion might produce 10,000 cases of severe burns if you were not paying attention. So in an all-out war, lethal fallout would cover much of the United States. Survivors could avoid fatal radiation exposure only when sheltered with adequate food, water, and medical supplies. Even then, millions would be exposed to radiation high enough to cause lower disease resistance and greater incidence of subsequent fatal cancer. Lower disease resistance could lead to death from an everyday infection in a population deprived of adequate medical facilities. And the spread of diseases from contaminated water supplies, non-existent sanitary facilities, lack of medicines, and the millions of dead could reach epidemic proportions. Small wonder that the international group, Physicians for Social Responsibility, has called nuclear war the last epidemic. So, attempts to contain damage to cities, suburbs, and industries would suffer analogous to the treatment of injured people. Firefighting equipment, water supplies, electric power, heavy equipment, fuel supplies, and emergency communications would be gone. Transportation into and out of stricken cities will be blocked by debris. The scarcity of radiation monitoring equipment and personnel trained to operate it will make it difficult to know where emergency crews could safely work. Most of all, there would be no healthy neighboring cities to call on for help. All would be crippled in an all-out war. So, the big question is nuclear war survivable? We've noted that more than half the United States population might be killed outright in an all-out nuclear war. What about the survivors? So recent studies have used detailed three-dimensional block-by-block urban terrain models to study the effect of 10 kiloton detonations on Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles. The results settle an earlier controversy about whether survivors should evacuate or shelter in place. In the 1970s, I believe it was, and the early 80s, they would do the duck and cover. Like, remember, kids, don't look at the nuclear blast because you can go blind. But nobody ever spoke about their eyeballs melting out of their skulls. So, staying indoors for 48 hours after a nuclear blast is now recommended. That time allows fallout levels to decay by a factor of 100. Furthermore, buildings between a survivor and a blast can block the worst of the fallout, and going deep inside an urban building can lower fallout levels still further. The same shelter-in-place arguments apply to survivors in non-urban areas blanketed by fallout. These new studies, however, consider only single detonations that might occur in a terrorist or rogue attack. In considering an all-out nuclear war, we have to ask further questions. Then what? Individuals might survive for a while, but what about long-term, and what about society as a whole? Extreme and cooperative efforts would be needed for long-term survival. But would be shocked and weakened survivors be up to those efforts? How would individuals react to watching their loved ones die of radiation sickness and untreated injuries? Would an everyone for themselves attitude prevail, preventing the cooperation necessary to rebuild society? How would residents of undamaged rural areas react to the streams of urban refugees flooding their communities? What governmental structure could function in the post-war climate? How could people know what was happening throughout the country? Would international organizations be able to cope? Some students of nuclear war see post-war society in a race against time. An all-out war would have destroyed much of the nation's productive capacity and would have killed many of the experts who could help guide social and physical reconstruction. The war also would have destroyed stocks of food and other materials needed for survival. On the other hand, the remaining supplies could have support only the much smaller post-war population. The challenge of the survivors would be to establish production of food and other necessities before the supplies left before the war were exhausted. Could the war-shock survivors, their social and governmental structures shattered, meet that challenge? That very big nuclear question. So big that is best left unanswered, since only an all-out nuclear war could decide it definitively. So, there we go. Now that we've covered that, you should realize that if an all-out nuclear war happens, we're pretty much screwed to the wall. So, there we go. That was today's episode. If you guys are watching this on YouTube, you guys can also head on over to the description, check out the merch, or you can listen to the audio version of this, so you don't have to be on YouTube. Also, head on to the community tab and check out my other show, Nightmare Road. So remember, guys, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you.